Ready. Hello, my name is Eric Shamel.
And my name is Alexis.
And we are both part of History 3CH3, the history of natural and technological disasters. Today, I am interviewing Alexis about her project on the Exxon oil crisis.
Yes, Exxon Valdez oil crisis.
Indeed. So, tell me, Alexis, how does the AIDS crisis inform your disaster?
So the AIDS crisis is really interesting in the fact that the government chose to get rid of all power in relation to the AIDS and push that to the people. That also happened with the Exxon disaster, where the government kind of took a back seat to the regulations that were being upheld by the oil industry and pushed it to the oil industry, and then the oil industry gave that power to alternative companies who did not withhold that power. And when they dropped the ball on cleaning up the oil after Exxon ran aground, the government did not step in and deal with the situation. They waited until Exxon would come in and deal with it.
All right. That makes sense. Yeah. What about economically? There's got to be an economic relationship considering this is like the oil industry.
Most definitely. So the Prince William Sound is where the Exxon Valdez ran aground on Bly Reef, and that is so ecologically important to Alaska. And in the winter, as we know, Alaska is in the north, and the north gets cold, therefore the water freezes. So the government did not put any kind of regulations on the shipping lanes. So the government was taking all the money from the oil industries as the Alaska was producing this oil, and instead of using that money to better the place, it instead just used it to exploit the people and allowed for shoddy work to happen and shoddy regulations to happen, and then the Exxon Valdez ran aground on Bly Reef, and then it just was horrible after that in terms of oil leaking. It was the worst disaster in U.S. history until 2010, when.
Yeah, no, there's definitely similarities between this kind of not really taking into consideration sort of the people and really fearing for sort of a certain kind of people over another, especially since this is Alaska. Who's living in Alaska? Not necessarily the people that the government catered to.
Yes, most definitely. It's not the people that the government was catering to, especially in 1898 when this happened. The government was not catering to those who were living in small fishing communities, and that's very similar to the AIDS crisis that Irit is studying in terms of the government not catering to the gay men who were in fact being infected by AIDS at this point.
Yes, in fact, they had their rights systematically removed as part of this. They, in the attempt to protect, the general public, whatever that means, they had to systematically remove rights that gay men fought so hard during this 1960s. That's when they championed their own rights. That's when they were taken away. This became less of a civil rights issue and more of a different kind of issue altogether.
Most definitely, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So during your blog, what are like the main things you focus on?
So one of the main points of my blog is the people and how the people were treated after this happened. So the people who are living within the Sound are the people who live sustainably from fishing, and obviously if oil spills into the water, then the fishing is impacted, but it's also impacted that the oil was washing onto the beaches. Now, I know we've all seen photos of oil being washed onto sand beaches, but in Alaska, because it is so cold, sand isn't really present there. The beaches are made of large rocks. So when oil washes onto the rocks, it pools and creates dangerous things for animals and also humans to step in, because the oil that was being transported on Exxon Valdez was crude oil. So it's very harmful to humans because it's unrefined.
You've mentioned before, like, that these were sustainable fishing communities. Were these,
Yes.
like, indigenous communities at all, or no?
Most definitely, yes. So the majority of them, we can't speak for every single person, but more times than not, these were indigenous people who were born Alaskan, raised Alaskan, and doing the fishing that would support not only their own families, but also selling the fish to other people in Alaska, and thus allowing their fishing businesses to continue. And when I say fishing businesses, I literally just mean it was an individual boat that they went out and caught fish with and came back.
Jeez. That's not... So when they so there was just very little like economic reason to intervene at that point because
Yeah.
it's such a
Most definitely. The government kind of didn't really care, and something that if you study the 2010 oil spill as well as the Exxon Valdez oil spill, in 2010, BP gave money to everyone who could potentially have been affected. If you said you lived there and you'd had a photography business and all of a sudden the water was tainted by the oil, the BP gave you money. But in Exxon Valdez, they were very tight with their purse strings and they didn't give money to anybody. They said, take us to court. And you went to court and you got a ruling, but then after that, they had to go back to court because the company was like, my high-priced lawyer is going to say, nope, not happening. And it was just this whole go-around in court. And they were still in court in 2013 for this. And
Jeez.
the people who were affected, I think the company is just waiting for them to die and then not have any kind of effects at all, which is ridiculous, which is kind of like what happened with the AIDS crisis in terms of the government or the people who were responsible were kind of just like waiting for the disease to kill the people so they wouldn't really like have to deal with it.
Yeah, but there was so much anger and so much family to support at the very least. And, you know, let's be real here, these were white people living
Yes.
in middle America and in cities. So there's a certain amount of privilege they had in their ability to protest and create action. How did disaster management happen?
So with mine, it's very similar to yours in the way that the government kind of stepped back and said, not me. So when they put the pipeline in place to allow the ships to come and fuel with oil, they put some regulations in place. And I say regulations with air quotes because these were not followed. They were supposed to have double-hulled ships. They didn't have. Exxon Valdez was not one that was double-hulled, and the government really didn't enforce that. They also hired a private company that the oil companies who shipped out of Exxon, which is the port, had. But this company just decided because a major oil spill hadn't happened that they really didn't need to have the boats in the water, and they really didn't need to have the people on the boats, and they really didn't need to have the equipment. So when the disaster happened, like the oil spilled into the water, it took so long for anyone to come to their rescue, to come to stop the oil leaking, because the captain had reported falsely that it was just some oil, but it was really barrels and barrels and barrels and barrels of oil that were leaking, and it was ridiculous amounts of oil, as well as the fact that they thought that this private company that all of the oil companies were paying into would take care of it. But no, their ships were in dry dock, so they had to get them out of dry dock and then ship them there. But the problem was they didn't even have the equipment to clean it up. So it's similar to AIDS in the way that they didn't have the medicine, and pharmaceutical companies were controlling that. Just like with this, the companies who had the material that they needed to clean up the oil in the water were controlling it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess one of the final questions I have is just sort of what sort of happened after? What has happened historically after this event?
So historically after, people still probably don't know of it until 2010 when it was mentioned as like, BP took over from Exxon as the greatest disaster, but then it was really never covered at all. The people in Alaska are still dealing with it to this day as the marine life has been affected by.
So the government still hasn't fixed it?
No. There's still oil on the beaches that's persistent there. There's still oil in the water from the field dispersants that are being used. It's just still what I would consider to be very harmful to the environment and to the people because the ecosystem is so fragile there, and the people who live there depend on the fragile ecosystem. It's very sad. Just like the AIDS crisis, that people still are suffering from AIDS, even though it's a disease that modern pharmacology can take care of, but people are choosing to make money instead of help people's lives and eradicate a disease that is completely eradicatable, if that's the word to use.
It's treatable. There's not a
Treatable,
cure
yeah.
yet, and the treatment is expensive and costs it. Yeah, you know. But the fact that there is treatment is its own sort of conclusion to the crisis, whereas with this, it doesn't seem like it gets an adequate conclusion.
Very true, yes.
Well, dang. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for interviewing me, Irie. It was very enjoyable.
Thank you. We'll see you again, I guess.